Assalamu alaikum. This is Sabia Afroj, lecturer, Department of English. Dear students and viewers, welcome to my online class. I hope you are well and safe by the grace of Almighty. Dear students, today our class is for the students of Honours Second Year, Department of English. And today our subject is History of English Literature. The subject code of this subject is 221107. And today I will discuss the Victorian age of English literature. Dear learners, I will try to discuss the duration of the Victorian age, the important or major poets of the Victorian age, and the important characteristics of Robert Browning's poetry. At first, I will discuss the duration of the Victorian age. Dear students, Victorian age is one of the most important ages of English literature, and the duration of the Victorian age is from 1832 to 1900 on. Actually, this age was an age of conflict between science and religion, and Victorian age was also an age of industrial revolution and scientific development. However, there are many important writers in the Victorian age. All of them tried to represent the main spirits of the Victorian age. Dear students, now I am going to discuss the major poets of the Victorian age. The major poets or the important poets of the Victorian age. Dear students, the major Victorian poets or the important Victorian poets are: number 1, Alfred Tennyson; number 2, Robert Browning; and number 3, Matthew Arnold. Now, I will try to discuss their contribution to English literature. At first, Alfred Tennyson. Dear students, Alfred Tennyson is one of the greatest poets of the Victorian age, and Tennyson is called the representative poet of the Victorian age because he represented the age in his poems very beautifully. Dear students, Tennyson represented his age or the Victorian age not in fragments but completely. And Tennyson's famous poems are Ulysses, Tithonus, In Memoriam, The Locksley Hall, The Lotus Eaters, and The Lady of Shalott. In the poem The Locksley Hall, we find the materialism of the Victorian age or the Victorian people. And in the poem Tithonus, we find that the protagonist of the poem is Tithonus, and Tithonus wanted to be immortal, though he was a human being. Here in this poem, in the poem Tithonus, we find two famous lines. These lines are: why should a man desire in any way to vary from the kindly race of man. Dear students, number 2, Robert Browning. Robert Browning is regarded as one of the greatest poets not only of the Victorian age but also of England. And his philosophy of life was very deep. Browning's famous poems are My Last Duchess, Rabbi Ben Ezra, Andrea del Sarto, Fra Lippo, and The Last Ride Together. And at last, number 3, Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold is another famous poet of the Victorian age. We find an elegiac note in his poetry or in his poems, in Arnold's poems. Arnold had a dark and gloomy view of man's journey on this planet. Dear learners, Arnold's famous poems are The Scholar Gypsy, Doverbees, Thyrsis, and the Rugby Chapel. Dear students, now I am going to discuss the major characteristics of Robert Browning's poetry. Dear students, the major characteristics of Robert Browning's poetry are: number 1, dramatic monologue; number 2, profound interest in character; number 3, descriptions of scenery and natural objects; number 4, optimism; and number 5, belief in the immortality of the soul. Now, I will discuss these characteristics of Robert Browning's poetry. Number 1, dramatic monologue. Dear students, Robert Browning is a famous writer of dramatic monologues. Almost all of his poems are in the form of dramatic monologues. His famous dramatic monologues are My Last Duchess, Andrea del Sarto, Fra Lippo, etc. Dear students, you know the definition of dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is a poem in which a single speaker speaks to a silent listener. In the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, we find that the Duke is the speaker, and in the poem Andrea del Sarto, Andrea is the speaker. And number 2, profound interest in character. Profound interest in character, it is another characteristic of Browning's poetry. Browning had a profound interest in character. And we find in the poem My Last Duchess the easy and very simple character of the Duchess. And in the poem Andrea del Sarto, we find the characters of Andrea and his wife Lucrezia. Number 3, descriptions of scenery and natural objects. Descriptions of scenery and natural objects, it is another characteristic of Browning's poetry. Browning described the scenery and natural objects very beautifully. In the poem Andrea del Sarto, we find the beautiful landscape and the natural setting reflect the mind of Andrea. And number 4, optimism. Optimism is another characteristic of Robert Browning's poetry, and Browning was very optimistic. We find his optimism in his poems. At last, number 5, belief in the immortality of the soul. Belief in the immortality of the soul, it is another characteristic of Robert Browning's poetry. Browning was a religious person and he believed in God and afterlife. In the poem Andrea del Sarto, we find that Andrea also believed in the immortality of the soul. So, dear learners, these are the characteristics of Robert Browning's poetry. Dear students, I think you have understood the duration of the Victorian age, major Victorian poets, and the major characteristics of Robert Browning's poetry. And that's all for the moment. Thank you.